hopefully make it through 16 today, around there. And let's begin with prayer. Lord, we thank you for Deuteronomy, and we ask that you would help us to see it with new eyes. Probably most of us haven't spent a ton of time in this book, and I just pray that it would be something that lifts our spirits and helps us to know you better. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I have a question to open up, and I'd like you to share your thoughts and just your feelings about this. This is my question. Is God strict or lenient? Raise your hand when you're ready to answer that. Is he strict or lenient? What would you say? Raise your hand. Okay. Got a couple? Okay.
Very lenient, thank goodness.
Okay. Do you have a reason for saying that?
His grace is far, far more than I deserve.
Okay, so you would say that that's leniency. Okay.
God's laws are very strict because he is holy. The grace of Christ is very lenient. Now, how do we choose?
Okay. Good answer. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Louise.
Wait, I'm coming. You gotta stay in the microphone.
He's slow to anger.
That's good. Sloan was not slow. She got over there quick. He is slow to anger, yes. Do you think that God is harsh or gentle and kind? Jessica in the back.
I think that's a matter of perspective. I think many of us as believers would say he's kind, but everybody else, why would a loving God send all these people to hell who don't deserve it, all that stuff? So I think it depends on where you're standing from.
Okay, I think that's true. Yes? Yep, Bob has another answer to this one.
I think that the issue is not God, but us. If we are in disobedience, what do we expect? But if we are washed in the blood of Christ and living by faith, you expect a grace. And so the issue is more than us judging God, but us conforming.
Good. Yep. Yeah, I think when you're studying Deuteronomy, these questions pop up, I think, because we see that God is strict in his laws and yet lenient in his heart, even in Deuteronomy. His punishments sometimes can seem extremely severe, and we'll see that as we go through this, but his gentle kindness for the poor, for the needy, for everyone is really evident. And I think that the trick is that his love is the motive behind it all. His love is the motive behind his hatred for sin and his desire to see us live righteous, holy lives, and is the motive behind his leniency and his love and gentleness and kindness as well. So we talked about, Hal filled in for me last week, but a few weeks ago I introduced Deuteronomy, and I talked about it, that it's a covenant document. So people would make treaties in the ancient world, either between each other or, a king would make a treaty with the people that he's about to govern, and they would make documents that would outline what the treaty or what the covenant was. And that's what the book of Deuteronomy is. It's a treaty, a covenant document outlining how things are going to go between God, who is the king, and Israel, who are his people. We've been through the preamble right at the beginning in chapter 1. We went through the historical prologue where Moses talked about, these are all the things that happened, how God brought you out of Egypt. He led you to this point, but you sinned, and all these things. Then, last week, Hal covered what's called the general stipulations. This is what God wants you to be like. He wants you to love him with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. He wants you to fear him and follow his commands and not turn to other gods. These are general laws. And now in our passage today, we're starting what's called the detailed stipulations. These will go from chapter 12 through 26. These are detailing what it looks like to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, to follow him in his commands. This is what it looks like to do the 10 Commandments in real life. And that's what we're going to get into today. And the first command, if you'll look at chapter 12, if you have your Bibles, chapter 12 of Deuteronomy. The first of these detailed stipulations about how you're supposed to love the Lord and be faithful to him and not follow other gods is there is only one place, God says, where you are allowed to worship once you get into the land. You can't set up, temples all over. You can't set up altars in this place and that place. There has to be one specific place of worship. Let's look at the first few verses of this, chapter 12. There are the decrees. These are the decrees and laws you must follow in the land the Lord your God of your ancestors has given you to possess, as long as you live in the land. Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their idols and smash their sacred stones and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from those places. You must not worship God in their way, but you are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. And to that place you must go to offer your sacrifices and such. So in other words, God hasn't told them the place yet. They don't know where this one place is, but when they get into the land, God's going to say, this is the place I choose to put my name for my dwelling, and you got to go there. Now here's my question for you. And again, we'll need the mic for this, so raise your hands. Why do you think, because God doesn't tell us in chapter 12, why can't you worship God in more than one place? Why did he say it had to be one place that they had to come for worship and offering sacrifices and have a temple there? Oh boy. Oh.
Perhaps there's more than one reason. First one, the unity.
Yeah.
The second one would be what was shown when the they split into two nations and they set up another place and worshiped Baal. So the thoughts, that angered God, that they worshiped Baal. And the sin of Jeroboam is stated over and over and over. They would not let the northern kingdom, would not let the people come to Jerusalem to worship, totally against this word that we just read in Deuteronomy.
Yeah, you got it. So basically the idea is this. Different locations where people were worshiping God would end up worshiping God in different ways, or even leading to worshiping other gods. So if you have something here set up in Gilead and another thing set up in Jezreel, another thing over here, everything would, like, the way that they worshiped God would be different. The way they talked about God, the way they learned about him. In the ancient world, that was a long way away, and people that lived there didn't talk to people that lived down here, right? And so people would come up with their own ways. And this is what happened with Baal worship. Sometimes you'll see in the Old Testament that they call them the Baals, plural, because Baal became Baals. They all had different ideas about, depending on the location, what Baal was like and how to worship him. The same thing would happen to the Lord if they did that. So he said, there's one place. You must not worship the Lord your God in the way that the Canaanites do, he says. Their way is wrong. You got to destroy them and destroy their altars and things like that. He says at the end of chapter 12, in verse 30 and 31, After they've been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? We'll do the same. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things that the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire, and when they sacrifice to their gods. Their worship was wrong. They did detestable things in their worship, and God didn't want them to follow that way. And so he says, you got to have one place. And does anybody know, you don't have to raise your hand for this, does anybody know where the one place was? Jerusalem, that's right. And so this is connected to the first commandment. You shall have no other God before me. You know, this God is saying this, you have to be completely loyal and come to this one place. And he doesn't tell them yet that it's Jerusalem. God would choose the place, he says, from among all your tribes. Once you're settled in the land, he would choose a place to be the capital city of the nation, or the place where his name dwelt. And that would be where the king lived. And I think that's why he doesn't tell them right away, is because the king hadn't come yet. Where he would live would be where the city was. And so Jerusalem was in between Judah and Benjamin, right there in that area. Now I'm convinced that even though God didn't tell them that it was going to be Jerusalem, he knew long before he anointed David as king that that was the place where his name would be. And my reasoning for this is kind of backwards. I'm reasoning from the book of Revelation. At the very end of Revelation, the new Jerusalem comes down from heaven, and it's pictured as both a city and as the Garden of Eden, the sacred space of God. And it's complete with a river coming from the center of the city and the tree of life and everything. And so I think that Jerusalem is the center of the garden where God dwelt, and that he had put that place there from the beginning. Yes, Bob.
Mount Zion is Jerusalem is there at Mount Zion.
Right.
And that's where God had Abraham offer Isaac. So that was a designation.
That's right.
And they are the children of Abraham. When David became king, it was over the threshing floor that was there, where David saw the angel. So God had his way of pointing that out various ways.
That's good. So let me kind of zoom out and give you a little bit of history of Jerusalem. From the year 2000, which was the time of Abraham, 2000 BC, Jerusalem was already being mentioned as a major city in Egypt. And there were two events in the life of Abraham. Bob mentioned one, but there were two events that put him in the proximity of Jerusalem. The first was he met Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a king of, says Salem. It's the same city, Jerusalem. And Melchizedek came out and he blessed Abraham. You remember that story in Genesis 14. Became a famous story. Later, Abraham took his son Isaac to the same place called Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah seems to have been the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And that, so you can see that God already had Jerusalem in mind from long before David ever came, because David came 1,000 years after Abraham did. Jerusalem appears in a number of places in the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and in 2 Samuel, David comes in and conquers the Jebusites who lived there. And you remember the story? It's, I think, chapter 5 of 2 Samuel. They were in this city, the Jebusites, and they said, you can never get in here. Even if we were all blind and lame, you still couldn't take our city. Remember that? And they climb up through a water duct and get in there and destroy them. And it becomes the city of David, God's chosen place. Now, Israel, unfortunately, did not continue to worship there. I'm talking about the northern kingdom of Israel, not Judah. Do you remember what happened? Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom. When Rehoboam, the kingdom was split during Rehoboam's time, and Jeroboam became the first king. And Jeroboam thought, I need to do something because everybody's going to start going back down to Jerusalem to do their worshiping, right? And if they go down to Jerusalem, they're just going to revert back to King Rehoboam and David's line. And so in order to keep my kingship, I need to do something. And so he built 2 golden calf idols, one in Bethel and one up in Dan, I think. And people went and worshiped those instead of worshiping God at Jerusalem. And it caused all kinds of trouble, like Bob was saying. Like those golden calf idols lasted all the way through Israel's history until finally they were exiled by the Assyrians. Also, besides the golden calves, Israel and Judah constantly had problems with a thing called high places. And it was mentioned there in Deuteronomy chapter 12. Ancient people, I think that how they thought was, the mountains are closer to heaven. If you're going to meet with a god, you climb up a mountain, right? And when there was no mountains, like in Iraq region where Babylon was and things like that, you built a ziggurat so you could climb up steps and get to heaven, that sort of thing. So they would build these altars on mountains and high places, and they would worship their gods, and especially under what were called spreading trees, terebinth trees. They would worship their gods, their fertility gods there. They wanted the god to send rain, make their land fertile, and so what they basically did was they were fertile there. They had temple prostitutes that would come to these high places and do sex acts and all kinds of things that were detestable to God. And Israel and Judah continued keeping the high places through their whole history. And God kept telling them, don't do that, don't do that. At one point, Hezekiah, that great king Hezekiah, destroyed all of the high places. And he only had the temple, right? And if you remember that story, the king of Assyria comes. I'm sorry if I lose you on this. I realize I'm not going to these passages, but the king of Assyria comes and he says, look, your king Hezekiah had destroyed all of the Lord's high places, right? He's not pleasing to the Lord. Why are you following him? And he tries to talk the people out of coming. But as Hezekiah understood that there was only supposed to be one place. Now, consider all these things. You know, Jerusalem's supposed to be the one place where you worship God. There's not supposed to be these other places. And think about a passage in the New Testament. John chapter 4, when Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman. They have an argument or a debate. And what is that debate about? It's about Deuteronomy chapter 12. She says, and you can turn to this if you want, in John chapter 4, verses 19 through 24. I'm just going to read it for you. This is what the Samaritan woman says. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain. And she's Samaritan. She's talking about her Samaritan ancestors. And she's talking about Mount Gerizim. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where you must worship is in Jerusalem. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and truth. The reason for the debate is that Samaritans read a different version of the Torah, called the Samaritan Pentateuch. They only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, and there were some differences between their version and the version that the Jews read. And one of the main differences is that in the Samaritan Pentateuch, Moses specifically tells them that God chose Mount Gerizim. He doesn't say that God will choose a place for you when you get into the land. In that version, it says God chooses Mount Gerizim. That's where you must worship. That's the one place. And that's in Samaria. And in fact, there's 11 commandments instead of 10. And the 11th is that you should build an altar on Mount Gerizim. So they had these differences and these arguments that kept them apart from each other. And Jesus' answer correlates with Deuteronomy chapter 12. And the point of God's command that there should only be one place is for people to know God and to worship him correctly as pleases him. If worship centers were spread all over, there would be different priesthoods, there would be different offerings. God would not be known. And Jesus is saying is that the time is coming when God will really be known by his worshipers. They will really understand God through the Holy Spirit, through spirit and in truth. And he's saying it won't matter then where they worship, because they're worshiping him in spirit, that means by the Spirit, and in truth, worshiping God as he truly is. And that's why, as Christians, I think, they felt fine about establishing churches all over the world, in different cities all over, and they didn't need to come back to a centralized place of worship because they were the temple. The Spirit was in them, and they knew God and could worship him. So it's not that Deuteronomy 12, oh, well, now we can worship elsewhere. It's that the spirit of Deuteronomy 12 we still observe, to know God and worship him in the way that he commands. And we do so in the church all over the world now. Yes, Bob.
To worship God is not to worship a city or a temple. To worship God is to worship a person. And the person in the temple is Jesus, the Christ. If you've seen God, if you've seen me, if you know me, you know God. So he took not Garrison, and he said, and not Jerusalem, because we are lifted to the person, the authority of heaven and earth, who will one day come down and set up his kingdom there. And that is described in Ezekiel, the last part of Ezekiel. And it's beautiful to study the whole word and see how the pieces come together. But today in the church, we don't worship this building. We don't worship this ground. We worship the Son of God.
Right. Good. Let's move on to Deuteronomy 13. This chapter is about not worshiping false gods and not following people who tell you to. False prophets, they're called. If someone comes and tries to get you to worship a different god, here's what you do, he says. And this is related to the second commandment, to not have an idol or make any images of other gods. And the penalty for a false prophet in Israel who tries to get others to follow other gods is stoning. Everybody comes together, they take a hand in it, and they stone them. Listen to what Moses says in chapter 13, verses 6 through 11. This is what I meant by sounding strict or maybe even harsh. It could to our ears. He says, if your very own brother or your son or your daughter or your wife that you love or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods that neither your ancestors nor you have known, gods of the peoples around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other. Do not yield to them or listen to them. He says, show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all the people. Stone them to death because they tried to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and no one among you will do such an evil thing again. Now, here's someone, you could say maybe even your own brother or your own family member who says, hey, we should go worship this other god. He says, nip it right in the bud. Your hand should be the first to put them to death. And why is this penalty so harsh? He says in verse 3 of chapter 13, "The Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love him with all your heart, with all your soul. And if left unchecked, the false prophecy, the false teaching, the leading toward other gods would spread." And so he says in verse 5, "You must purge the evil from among you." At one point he says, if a whole town is worshiping another god, then you need to go in and kill everyone in that town. And instead of taking their stuff, gather it all into the middle of the city square and burn it all. Don't even touch it. Don't even get near it, because this town has gone to other gods. Now, there was a history of false prophets in the Old Testament. But the interesting thing is that there were many false prophets, but none of them suffered the fate of Deuteronomy 13. In fact, worship of false gods spread everywhere, like I was just talking about, high places and all those things. And it was actually the other way around. True prophets in the Old Testament were accused of being false prophets. This happened multiple times. So Micaiah, this is 1 Kings 22. Ahab says, I hate talking to him because he always prophesies bad things for me. He was the prophet of the Lord. And another prophet accused him of being a false prophet, and he was put into jail. Jeremiah was accused multiple times of being a false prophet because he wasn't giving people the news they wanted to hear. He was telling them bad news. And Jeremiah was shut up in a cistern without food or water and almost died, and then he was taken to Egypt at the end of the book. When he refused to go, he was taken by force. Amos was accused as a false prophet in chapter 7. And so these prophets were even killed, like Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, was killed between the altar and the temple for telling people that they were disobeying the Lord. The prophet Isaiah, according to tradition, was sawn in two by King Manasseh because of his prophecy. The real prophets were the ones that were being put to death. Now, Jesus was charged with blasphemy based on Deuteronomy 13. People were saying, he's a false prophet. We actually need to follow through. The Pharisees were saying, we are the biblical people who take this seriously. We're going to follow through on Deuteronomy 13, and he's got to be put to death. Listen to this line listen to verse 1 and 2 of Deuteronomy 13. "If a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a sign or wonder," in other words, they're doing miracles and stuff, "and if the sign or wonder spoken of takes place, and the prophet says, 'Let us follow other gods you've not known, and let us worship them,' and then it goes on to say, this is what you're supposed to do, put them to death." Jesus was a prophet. He was performing signs and wonders in front of all the people, and he also predicted the destruction of the temple. And he told people to follow him. This was the case that was used against him. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law said he's promoting other gods, and the other gods that he's promoting he's calling himself God. He's doing these signs and wonders. He's a trickster. We got to put him to death. And it's interesting that they fail over and over again to see the true God speaking to them. But then when false prophets speak to them, they believe them and go along with them. That's a sad thing. And this also happens in the church. And it's not like Jesus or the apostles said, oh, don't worry about false prophets. Don't worry about Deuteronomy 13. They took Deuteronomy 13 seriously too. They warned against false prophets and false teachers. You can see it all throughout the New Testament. Jesus calls them sheep in wolves' clothing, these people that will come in among you. And no mercy is given to false prophets or teachers in the New Testament. Listen to this, what Paul says in Galatians 1. This is verse 6 through 9. He says, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel contrary to the one that was preached to you, let him be accursed. As we've said before, so I say again, if anyone is preaching you a gospel contrary to the one you've received, let him be cursed." In 2 Corinthians 11, verses 13 through 15, Paul says this, "For such men are false prophets, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And so it's no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. 2 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 1. But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed. By covetousness they will exploit you with deceptive words. For a long time their judgment has not been idle, and their destruction does not slumber. And so false teaching was mentioned here in Deuteronomy 13, bringing people to other gods. And when these people worshipped other gods, it was the real prophets that they thought were the fake ones. And we need to be careful as well when it comes to false prophets and false teachers in the church. There are those people today, and they're all over, and their messages on the internet all over. And people don't know, unless they know the word, that these people are out there. The Jewish people didn't know the word like they were supposed to, and they were led astray. Okay, any questions on chapter 13? Okay, and then after Bob, we have Barry back there.
The amazing thing, if you do not believe the truth, if you believe a lie, you fight the truth because you believe the lie. And that is throughout human history, even now upon this earth, believing the lie to be the truth. And therefore, you crucify the truth. That's what happened to Jesus. And that happens in society in many ways. Now, how do you then discern who is the liar and who is the truth? The liar will quickly be angry because he's on the side of anger, the devil's side. The truth person will have peace, even though he don't change his words. He holds to the truth. He holds the character of peace in his life. And that takes a lot of discernment in one-to-one communication there. But we who know Jesus also have the Holy Spirit to give us that discernment, and they don't have that. They have the devil.
That's right, yeah. And that's a good thought. Pride can sometimes convince us of lies, and people hold on to it and get angry. That's a good point. Barry.
Kevin, just to piggyback on what you said, I was reading this week that the military cut back on the recognized religions that they're going to recognize, but they started out, you talked about false prophets, and they're everywhere. They have 180 recognized religions. Mm-hmm. So if we don't think there's false prophets among us, we're silly.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Yeah, Micah over here.
Something I think is interesting is that all of these prophets were accused of being false, but to my knowledge, none of them met the fate of a false prophet where they're actually stoned. And I think in a way that is kind of a sign where though they died, they didn't meet the end that God would have had in store for them by his law, if that's something to think about.
Yeah, that's a good point. Though I will say that Jesus was almost stoned multiple times, and he didn't meet that fate, like you're saying. But even his own relatives, actually, in Luke chapter 4, we'll read about in Nazareth, they picked up stones to stone him. probably for this reason. And he slipped through their midst, which is cool. I had a math teacher in college, my one math class that I had to take, but he talked about that passage and something about math. And if I were smarter, I could tell you what it was, but it was cool. I don't know. All right, let's look at chapter 14. He goes into clean and unclean food again, and we learned about this, talked about this in Leviticus, and he brings it up again. And it might seem like a strange transition to go from false prophecy and leading people to worshiping false gods to talking about what Israelites can and can't eat for lunch, right? What's the difference there? But the same principle underlines both of them, which is the distinctiveness of Israel as a people who are wholly and exclusively committed to the Lord, right? That's why they were supposed to eat or not eat certain foods. And listen to verse 1 of chapter 14. This is how he starts out his talk about what food is clean and what's not. You are children of the Lord your God. And then he has a few other regulations like don't cut yourself or shave the front of your head for the dead. But then he goes on to, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. Don't eat any detestable thing, right? This is why. You are God's. You're not like other people. You are holy. You're set apart. Now, what made food clean or unclean? That's a hard question. And we talked about this a lot when I taught through Leviticus. I'm not going to spend as much time on it today. But the main thing, I think, is that unclean food was connected with death. Remember that life is holy, death is unholy. And a lot of the things that they couldn't eat were things like carrion birds, animals that ocean animals that fed on the bottom of the ocean rather than things like fish. They could eat fish, but they couldn't eat those types of things. And so there was a lot of that. Another reason may have been an animal's connection with idol worship. And so this is in Deuteronomy is the only time he mentions pigs not being clean. Okay, he doesn't mention that in Leviticus, but he mentions it here. And pigs were used, well known, they were used in idol worship and demon worship as sacrifices. And so it's possible that that's why, hey, don't eat pigs, as one of the reasons. I think there's more than that, and there's lots of debate. I'm not going to solve it today. So those are some reasons. But Jesus talked about clean and unclean food in Mark chapter 7. And, this was a big thing for the Israelites, for the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And he said something that shocked them in Mark chapter 7, verses 14 through 21. This is what it says. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. He had to say it like that because he knew. When you tell people something different than they know or heard, sometimes it just goes right over their head. They just fit it into the categories they know. Listen and understand this, he says. Nothing outside a person can defile them. Ingesting unclean food, pig flesh or whatever, it can't defile you by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them. And he said that, and it says, after he left the crowd, he entered the house, and his disciples asked him about this parable. They thought it was a parable, like describing something else. And he says, are you so dull? Don't you see that nothing enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. And when he says out of the body, literally in Greek, he means into the toilet. That's, it goes in and goes out. It doesn't touch the heart. That's the thing God's concerned about. And then it says in Mark, by saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Now, Jesus' his point, of course, is that if a person's heart is unclean, it doesn't make any difference whether they only eat clean food or not. They're still unclean in God's eyes. But if they are clean in their heart, then what goes into them, the type of food they ingest, doesn't matter at all. Now, Paul also had discussions about food because he talked to churches where there were some Gentiles in the church and there were some Jews in the church, especially the church in Rome. There was a combination, and they didn't get along all that well sometimes. And he tells them, you got to stop passing judgment on the matter of food. But here's the idea behind it that Deuteronomy helps us with. The purpose of food being clean or unclean was to divide, to separate the Israelites from the cultures around them, to be holy unto the Lord. And so there were people in the church who were using food to separate themselves from other believers, saying, you eat this food, you're wrong. And it was causing division. And Paul's saying, no, don't let food cause division. Food is nothing, right? You have to have unity among yourselves. Don't use this thing that was supposed to divide Israel from the cultures to divide the church of God from itself. That was the idea. Okay, I have more, but I better stop for time, but I have a couple minutes for questions. So you can ask a question about this or about anything. Anybody have a question that you'd like to ask?
Daniel chapter 1. Daniel held to these teachings in Deuteronomy, and God blessed him there. The distinction is that Daniel's heart was pure too. He kept himself pure, and the Spirit of God bears witness with our spirit if what we are doing is not pure or if it is pure. And that can be carried over in a lot of ways. But that's what I have to focus on, heart purity. And not worry about all the fussing that goes on. And there's a lot of it.
Yeah. You know, even in Deuteronomy, the point goes back to the heart, just like Jesus. And this was probably brought out a lot in the chapter 6 through 11. It's the heart that matters to the Lord, and Jesus is pointing that out. He's not saying something different from the law. He's explaining it. Jessica.
Okay, so going back to the things with foods, what would you say, or how should we address, or is this something we should just let it be, for believers who call themselves Torah observant, who still hold to these food laws, although it's not required? Is that something that is a stumbling block, or what's the best way that we should respond to those people?
I think it is a stumbling block, and I think that they've missed the point. And I'm not going to say that they are wrong to observe those things, but they need to focus on Jesus and not on these things. And I've seen people like this, and often it leads to a bad way, and even if it doesn't start that way. And so I would warn them personally, and I would pray for them, and I would care for them, and I would keep pointing them to Jesus. I think people like that often are going backwards instead of forwards. I mean, obviously, I love the law in the Old Testament. I study it. I think this is something that we should talk about. It's helpful for the church to talk about these things, and the church sometimes leaves this stuff out. But to go back and try to observe the law is to do exactly what Paul told us not to do, right? And they just miss the whole point of it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't like it, and I have concern for the people that do that. Okay, well, we better stop. Thank you for coming. Enjoyed the class.